Being in a relationship or marriage comes with its ups and its downs, but sadly, sometimes they end in absolute tragedy. I've seen my fair share of violence in intimate relationships over my career, but certain calls always stay with you, and this case is one of them. We have a male, let's call him Thomas, who calmly enters a police station and confesses to a fatal domestic incident involving his girlfriend a day and a half ago. But the most chilling part wasn't the confession itself. It was the fact that he had been living in the house, going about his daily routine, while concealing the tragedy in the basement ever since. We are about to uncover the horrifying secret Thomas tried to bury in his basement. But before we unlock the doors to this silent fortress, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps our research team continue to bring these mysterious and important stories to light. Now, let's go back to that Thursday evening on Roosevelt Drive. The evening of March 31st, 2022, settled over the city of Milwaukee with a deceptive calm. Inside the district police station, the atmosphere was thick with the mundane routine of a slow shift. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, white glow across the linoleum floors and the plexiglass barriers that separated the public from the law. For the desk officer on duty, the night promised little more than paperwork, the occasional noise complaint, or perhaps a minor traffic dispute. There was no electricity in the air, no premonition that a horrifying secret was about to walk through the front doors. The heavy silence of the lobby was broken only by the sound of the entrance opening. A man stepped inside. He moved with a heavy, deliberate gait, not like someone fleeing a scene in a panic, but like a person who had been walking toward this specific moment for a very long time. He approached the front desk, his demeanor quiet and resigned. To the officer sitting behind the counter, the man appeared ordinary. There was no weapon in his hand, no blood on his clothes, and no immediate sign of the chaos he had left behind. The officer looked up, expecting a standard inquiry. Perhaps the man was there to pay a fine or check on a warrant. The officer began the interaction with professional courtesy, ready to type a name into the database and send the visitor on his way. The man stood before the desk, the weight of his actions seemingly pressing down on his shoulders. "There you go," the officer said, perhaps referencing a document or a piece of identification, prepared to process a routine administrative task. But the man had not come for administrative work. He had come to unburden himself of a reality that was too heavy to carry alone any longer. He looked at the officer, his voice steady but laden with a dark truth. "I hurt my girl a day and a half ago," the man stated. The words hung in the air, clashing violently with the sterile quiet of the station. The officer paused, his mind taking a moment to bridge the gap between the mundane evening he expected and the confession he had just heard. It was a statement that defied the immediate logic of the situation. Usually, when violence occurs, the police are called to the scene amidst chaos and sirens. Rarely does the violence walk calmly into the station days later, asking to be heard. "You shot her?" the officer asked, the tone likely one of clarification rather than accusation, needing to ensure he had heard the man correctly. He immediately asked for the man's identification and his last name, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, ready to search for a crime that surely must have already been reported. The officer's mind raced. If a shooting had occurred 36 hours prior, the system should be flashing with alerts. There should be a homicide investigation open, a manhunt underway, or a missing person report filed. The officer began looking up the man's information in the database, mid-believing that the man had come to confess to a crime the department already knew about. "What, you supposed to turn yourself in here or one of the jails?" the officer asked, trying to determine if the man was surrendering on an active warrant. "What are you turning yourself in for?" The man, Ellis, repeated his confession, ensuring there was no misunderstanding. "I shot my girl," he said again. The officer pressed for details, the professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the confusion beneath. "You did what?" Ellis began to explain, offering a narrative that seemed to minimize the horror of the act. He described the incident not as a cold-blooded attack, but as a domestic moment gone wrong. "We was horseplaying and the gun went off," Ellis claimed, characterizing the fatal moment as an accident born of carelessness rather than malice. "Okay, how long ago was this?" the officer asked, trying to establish a timeline. "Hell, I stuck with her for a while," Ellis admitted, a chilling revelation that implied he had remained with the victim long after the incident occurred. The officer searched the screen in front of him, looking for a match, a dispatch log, anything that corroborated the story. "Did the police come out for that or no?" the officer asked. "No," Ellis replied. "I'm just now coming up here for that." The implications of this answer were terrifying. It meant that for a day and a half, while the city moved on, a woman lay dead or dying in a home, unnoticed by the world. It meant there were no sirens, no paramedics, and no rescue. "Where is she?" the officer asked, the most critical question of the night. "She's still there?" "Yeah," Ellis confirmed. "She lived no." The officer processed this finality. "Oh, okay. They never did a report, nothing." "No," Ellis said. "That's what I was looking for. I thought that." He trailed off, perhaps admitting that he had spent the last 2 days waiting for the police to kick down his door, waiting for the consequences to find him. When they did not come, he realized he had to come to them. "That's good. Turn around for me," the officer instructed, shifting from the role of listener to enforcer. The confession was recorded. The freedom of the man named Ellis was at its end. As the officer moved to place handcuffs on him, asking if he had any weapons on his person, Ellis remained compliant. He did not resist. He seemed to accept that his time as a free man had expired the moment the weapon discharged days earlier. "We got to do it in the back, man." "Sorry," the officer said, maintaining a respectful but firm tone as he prepared to secure the suspect. Ellis stood there, his wrists bound, and the reality of his future began to settle in. He looked at the officer, a stranger who now held his fate. "My life is gone," Ellis murmured, a realization that seemed to eclipse even the death of the woman he had left behind. The officer, perhaps trying to keep the situation volatile, free, or perhaps genuinely struck by the strangeness of the voluntary surrender, offered a strange form of validation. "It'd take a real man to come and—" "Knew what they did," the officer remarked. But as Ellis was led away to the interrogation room, the station lobby returned to its quiet state. However, the stillness was now charged with a dark urgency. Somewhere in the city, in a house that had been silent for too long, a woman was waiting to be found. The police knew her location now. The clock, which had been paused for 36 hours by Ellis's silence, suddenly began to tick violently fast. The secret was out of the basement, and the long night on Roosevelt Drive was just beginning. The transition from the public lobby to the secure area of the station shifted the dynamic instantly. The officer, now joined by a partner to assist with the processing, guided Ellis into a small interview room. The metallic click of the handcuffs, securing Ellis's wrists behind his back, signaled the official end of his autonomy. There was no struggle, only a heavy, suffocating compliance. The air in the room was tight, charged with the gravity of the statement Ellis had just uttered in the lobby. The officer needed to deconstruct that sentence, "I shot my girl," into actionable facts before the detectives took over. "I got you," the officer said, checking the fit of the restraints. He needed to understand the immediate medical necessity of the situation, though Ellis's past tense usage suggested it was already too late for paramedics. "Did she go to the hospital or anything?" the officer asked, searching for a shred of hope that the victim might still be fighting for her life. Ellis shook his head. "No," he replied flatly. The officer pressed further, his voice dropping to a serious, investigatory cadence. "Where did you shoot her at?" "The house?" "The room," Ellis clarified, his voice devoid of the panic one might expect from a tragic accident. He explained that after the incident in the room, he had moved her. "She stopped, so I took her to the basement," he said. The officer paused, processing the mechanics of what Ellis was describing. A shooting in a bedroom, followed by the movement of a body to the basement. This detail immediately contradicted the idea of a frantic accident where one calls for help. Moving a victim to a basement was an act of concealment, not aid. "She is down in the basement?" the officer asked. needing absolute confirmation for the patrol units that were about to be dispatched. "Yeah," Ellis confirmed. "Okay," the officer said, keeping his tone neutral to prevent Ellis from shutting down. "I mean, what she looked like right now." He needed to prepare the responding officers for what they would find. Ellis hesitated, perhaps visualizing the scene he had fled. With about 7 hours, he muttered, his sense of time distorted by the isolation of the last 2 days. He then looked at the officer, the reality of his confinement crashing down on him. "I walk through this. I know my life is gone," Ellis said, his focus shifting entirely to his own future rather than the woman he had left in the dark. The officer, skilled in keeping suspects talking, offered a bridge of empathy. I mean it take a real man to come and knew what they did," the officer said, validating Ellis's decision to surrender to keep the information flowing. "If it's an accident, it's an accident. Only you, her, and God know what really happened." This statement seemed to unlock Ellis further. He needed to be believed. He needed the police to see this as a mistake, not a murder. "I commend you for that," the officer added. "I would have family be messed up." Now that rapport was established, the officer pivoted to the weapon. If the gun was still in the house, it posed a danger to the officers who were currently speeding toward Roosevelt Drive. "Is the gun still at the house?" the officer asked. Ellis shook his head. He explained that after the shooting, he had left the property. "I drove off in the dollar store after I left from the house," he admitted. He had disposed of the weapon, adding another layer of calculation to his actions. A man who shoots his partner by accident calls 911. A man who disposes of the weapon is covering his tracks. "Okay," the officer said, noting this destruction of evidence. "Anybody else know?" "Just you?" "Just you and her and God," Ellis replied, echoing the officer's earlier sentiment. "This will be my life forever now." The officer ignored the self-pity and focused on the logistics of entry. The house was locked. If the police broke down the door without cause, it could complicate the legal case. But Ellis was giving them permission. He offered his keys. "Look at the key right here," Ellis said, gesturing as best he could. "Which key is the one on this one right here?" the officer asked, examining the keyring Ellis had provided. Ellis began to lament the consequences again. "I have to go telling my daughter," he murmured. "I feel bad for everything." He speculated on the length of his sentence, tossing out a number that felt abstract to him in that moment. "About 80 years, he guessed. The officer did not correct him, but did not confirm it either. "Hey, that's to be with you. That's up to the judge," the officer said, deflecting the legal outcome to focus on the immediate investigation. "I mean, as long as you be honest with everything that went down. Tell them like where different stuff at, what occurred, that's gonna help you out." They sat in the small room, the weight of the confession settling between them. The officer needed to clarify the timeline one last time. The dispatchers were asking for specifics. "So this is Thursday," the officer calculated aloud. "It happened Tuesday or yesterday." "It happened Tuesday," Ellis corrected, then hesitated. "Or yesterday. It's Thursday now." The days had blurred together in the dark house. Yesterday or Tuesday. So Tuesday. So Wednesday. So technically yesterday morning, Ellis stammered, trying to piece together the lost hours. 2 in the morning yesterday. The timeline was becoming clearer. A full day and a half had passed since the gun went off. 36 hours of silence. "And you said, where was she shot at?" the officer asked, needing to be specific for the coroner. "It was fatal," Ellis stated clearly. "Just one tragic moment." "What kind of gun was it?" the officer asked. "380, Ellis replied, identifying the caliber. The officer nodded. He had the location, the basement. He had the time, early Wednesday morning. He had the cause, a single gunshot wound to the head from a .380 caliber weapon, and he had the perpetrator sitting right in front of him, oscillating between performative remorse and deep self-preservation. "I appreciate you not being—" "Oh, no," Ellis rambled. thankful that the officer was treating him with humanity despite the monstrous nature of his confession. "Regardless of the situation, as long as you cool, I'm going to be cool," the officer assured him. "I ain't even like that. At the end of the day, we all human, we all make mistakes." It was a tactic, a way to keep the man calm, but the officer's next words carried a heavy weight. "Like I said, it'd take a real man to come here and do that. I wish it was a little earlier for you, you know." That was the crux of the tragedy. If Ellis had been a real man 36 hours ago, perhaps the outcome would have been different. Perhaps there would have been a chance for medical intervention. But he had waited. He had waited until the silence in the house became too loud to bear. "You still came in here at the end of the day," the officer concluded, closing the loop on the immediate interrogation. "You could have did so many other things." Ellis nodded, accepting the small credit for finally ending the charade. He watched as the officer prepared to leave the room to radio the units waiting on the street. The conversation was over. The secret was recorded. Now, the officers on Roosevelt Drive had to open the door and face the reality Ellis had tried to hide in the dark. The time for hushed tones was finished. The time for discovery had arrived. The air in the interrogation room grew heavy, not with the humidity of the approaching spring, but with the suffocating weight of inevitability. Ellis sat in the chair, his hands now bound, his freedom formally exchanged for a confession. The officer stood opposite him, needing one final, tangible piece of evidence to bridge the gap between the man's words and the reality waiting on Roosevelt Drive. "Look at the key right here," Ellis said, his voice low, gesturing toward his personal effects that had been confiscated. The officer picked up the keyring, a mundane collection of metal that now held the potential to unlock a crime scene. He needed to be precise. He did not want his team fumbling in the dark, trying every key while the clock ticked. "Which key is the one on this one right here?" the officer asked, holding up the ring for Ellis to identify. Ellis squinted, pointing out the specific key that would open the front door of the duplex. It was a simple silver instrument, yet it felt heavy in the officer's hand. This key was the only thing standing between the police and the horrifying secret Ellis had kept for nearly 2 days. With the access to the house secured, the officer's mind pivoted to the safety of his colleagues. They were about to walk into an unknown environment. Ellis had confessed to a shooting, which meant there was a firearm involved. The officer needed to know exactly where that weapon was located. If it was lying on a table or hidden near the door, it posed a threat. "Is the gun still at the house?" the officer asked, his tone sharpening slightly. Ellis shook his head. The narrative of the accident began to fracture under the weight of his calculated actions following the event. He did not drop the weapon in shock. He did not leave it where it fell. "Where the gun at?" the officer pressed. "I drove to, off. In the dollar store after I left from the house," Ellis admitted, his speech slightly fragmented. He explained that he had taken the weapon with him when he finally fled the silence of the home, disposing of it somewhere in the city. The officer processed this. A man who claims a tragic mistake does not typically spend time cleaning up the scene and then driving across town to hide the murder weapon. This was a consciousness of guilt. It was the action of someone trying to erase a moment that could never be erased. "Okay, somewhere in that. Man, I was just..." "Okay," the officer said, cutting off his own train of thought to keep Ellis focused. "Anybody else know? Just you?" "Just you and her, and God," Ellis replied again, invoking the divine witness to his crime. "This will be my life forever now." The officer stepped out of the room, the key clutched in his hand. He moved quickly to the dispatch desk. The information needed to be relayed immediately. There was no time to waste on the philosophy of the crime. The patrol units needed to know they were not just doing a welfare check. They were likely walking into a homicide scene. Across town, the radio in a patrol car crackled to life. 2 officers, already on their shift, listened to the dispatch. The voice on the other end gave them the address on Roosevelt Drive and a brief, bizarre summary of the situation. A man had walked into the district station. He had confessed. He said there was a body in the basement. The driver of the patrol car looked at his partner. The skepticism was palpable. In their line of work, they heard everything. Confessions from people who were mentally unstable, false reports, and pranks. But this felt different. The details were too specific. The suspect was already in custody, sitting in an interrogation room, giving them the keys to his own home. "You know what's going on?" one officer asked, as they navigated the evening traffic. "So I guess one of the updates that we got is bodies by a sink or something, or maybe in the basement," the other officer replied, reading the notes from the dispatch screen. "There a body?" the driver asked, still processing the surreal nature of the call. "Oh, no way. No," the passenger officer said, recounting the story he had just been told by the desk sergeant. "A guy walked in our district, saying he shot his girlfriend a couple days ago and he's been sleeping with her ever since then." The concept was chilling. Staying in the house with the victim for days. It spoke to a level of dissociation that was hard to comprehend. "But he came in to report that he shot him. So, we're going to look for a dead body," the officer continued, the reality setting in. "So, it's completely true. I can tell you that right now. It's completely true." The car turned onto Roosevelt Drive. The neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights just beginning to flicker on against the twilight. It looked like any other street in Milwaukee. There were no yellow tapes, no gathering crowds, no signs of distress. The house in question sat dark and silent, indistinguishable from its neighbors, except for the terrible knowledge the officers now possessed. They pulled up to the curb and killed the engine. The silence of the car was replaced by the static of their radios. They stepped out, their boots hitting the pavement. They were not there to stop a crime in progress. They were there to confirm a tragedy that had already concluded. One officer checked his equipment, his hand brushing near his holster instinctively, though the suspect was miles away in a cell. The danger here wasn't a gunman. It was the psychological horror of what lay behind the front door. "We got limited information, but this is all just like happening right now," one officer murmured to the other as they approached the walkway. They walked up the steps to the front porch. The house loomed over them, a silent fortress guarding its secret. The officer in the lead held the keys that had been surrendered just minutes ago at the station. He looked at the lock, then at the key. "Find out which door he goes in," the officer said, noting the multiple entrances common in duplexes. "There's a side door and a front door." They were standing on the threshold of the unknown. The wait was over. The conversation in the sterile safety of the police station had set this moment in motion. Now, they had to turn the key and see if Ellis's confession was the rambling of a disturbed mind or the cold, hard truth of a domestic nightmare. The metal key slid into the lock. The officers braced themselves. The investigation was about to move from the theoretical to the physical. The duplex on Roosevelt Drive stood silent against the darkening sky, a structure of brick and wood that betrayed nothing of the secrets Ellis claimed it held. To the casual observer walking down the street, it was just another home in a row of quiet residences, its windows dark and its presence unassuming. But to the four officers now standing on the concrete porch, the house felt less like a dwelling and more like a fortress, guarding a truth they were increasingly anxious to uncover. The lead officer held the keyring in his gloved hand. The metal felt cold, a tangible link to the man sitting in a holding cell miles away. Ellis had promised that these keys would grant them entry, a peaceful resolution to a welfare check that had originated from a confession of homicide. The officer selected the silver key Ellis had identified, the one that was supposed to unlock the front door and allow them to confirm or dismiss the gruesome story. He slid the key into the cylinder of the deadbolt. It went in smoothly, offering a moment of hope that this would be simple. He applied pressure, trying to turn it to the right. The key resisted. He tried turning it to the left. It held firm. He jiggled it slightly, thinking perhaps the tumblers were just old or stiff, worn down by years of use. But the mechanism refused to yield. The lock remained engaged, a stubborn barrier between the law and the interior. "Is it turning?" one of the other officers asked, watching closely from a few steps back. "Yeah, it's turning," the lead officer muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. "But it's not catching anything." He withdrew the key and tried the handle lock instead. Again, The key slid in but failed to rotate the mechanism. It was as if the house itself was rejecting their attempt to enter, maintaining the silence that Ellis had preserved for nearly 2 days. The officer looked at the key again, wondering if there had been a mistake. Had Ellis given them the wrong key, or was his mind so fractured by the events of the last 36 hours that he no longer remembered which key opened his own front door? "What's going on?" another officer asked, the tension among the group rising. They were exposed on the porch, visible to the neighborhood, trying to gain access to a property based on the word of a man who claimed to be a killer. "This key is not working for whatever," the lead officer stated, pulling the key out and examining the teeth of the metal. "You think they work for the back door at all?" They stepped off the porch and moved around the perimeter of the house, their flashlights cutting through the shadows of the side yard. They found the side entrance, another potential point of access. The lead officer tried the key again. The result was the same. The metal turned uselessly in the lock, or refused to turn at all. The fortress remained sealed. The officer keyed his radio, the static breaking the heavy silence of the yard. He needed to reach the team back at the district station, the ones who were still with Ellis. "We're having trouble with the locks," he reported into the microphone. "There's a side door and a front door. Ask him which lock. If it's the deadbolt or the doorknob that even works." Back at the station, the message was relayed to the interrogation room. The desk officer, who had listened to Ellis's quiet confession, now had to ask for technical instructions on how to break into the scene of the crime. The absurdity of the situation, asking a suspect for help in investigating him, was not lost on anyone. The voice came back over the radio, crackling with the distance. "The door in the front to the right. You asking whether it's the deadbolt or the doorknob?" The officers returned to the front entrance. They tried again, following the new instructions, manipulating the key with a mixture of finesse and force. They could see through the small window in the door. The interior was dark, still, and utterly silent. If Angela Lane was inside, she could not hear them. If she was inside, she could not unlock the door for them. "I can see." "Wait," the officer said, peering through the glass, trying to discern any movement, any sign of life or death. But there was nothing. Just the stillness of a house that had been paused in time. The failure of the keys added a layer of dread to the operation. It prolonged the moment of discovery. It forced the officers to stand on the precipice, knowing what likely waited for them on the other side but unable to reach it. The horseplay and the accident Ellis had described felt miles away. Here, in the cold evening air, the reality was a locked door, and a team of police officers realizing that the polite way of entering was no longer an option. "This one, man, it's a..." The officer trailed off, the sentence unfinished, as the key failed one last time. They looked at each other. The decision was made without needing to be spoken aloud. They had probable cause, they had a confession, and they had a potential victim inside who, however unlikely, might still need help. The time for keys and permission was over. The fortress would not open willingly. It would have to be forced. "Hang on," the lead officer said, stepping back from the door and reaching for his radio one last time to confirm their next move. "We got breaching tools if you want. Do you hang on?" "Never mind." The house on Roosevelt Drive had kept its secret for 2 days. It had hidden the violence from the neighbors and the world. But as the officers set aside the useless keys and prepared their heavy equipment, the silence was about to be shattered for good. The fortress was about to fall. The moment the decision was made to abandon the keys, the atmosphere on the porch shifted from administrative frustration to tactical precision. The polite attempts to enter the residence using the method Ellis had provided were over. The officers stood before the stubborn door, the metal of the lock having defeated their patience. It was time to use force. "All right, doing it," one officer announced, signaling the transition to the next phase of the operation. They needed leverage. The lead officer looked to his partner, assessing the physical requirements of breaching a secured entryway. "You, the biggest one," he noted, assigning the task of forcing the door to the officer with the most strength. The command was given to bring up the heavy equipment. "Hang on, we got breaching tools if you want," an officer called out, preparing to retrieve the necessary gear from the squad car to mechanically defeat the deadbolt. However, the urgency of the situation and the adrenaline of the moment took over. They did not wait for the specialized tools. Through sheer physical determination and force, they applied pressure to the entry. With a sudden, violent release of tension, the barrier gave way. The door swung open, shattering the 2 days of silence that had encased the home. The officers did not hesitate. They surged across the threshold, their presence announced with booming authority to ensure anyone inside knew exactly who was entering. "Milwaukee Police!" the lead officer shouted into the void of the house. They moved with practiced caution, weapons drawn, scanning for threats. Even though Ellis was in custody miles away, police procedure dictated that they treat the unknown environment as hostile. They could not be certain he was the only occupant, nor could they be certain his confession was the whole truth. "Milwaukee Police, we know you're in here. Announce yourself," an officer bellowed, his voice echoing through the hallway. The command was met with silence. There was no response, no movement, no sound of surrender. The officers began to clear the residence systematically, moving from the entryway into the main living spaces. They communicated in sharp, clipped sentences, coordinating their movements to cover every angle. "You guys want to clear that room? I'll hold this," one officer directed, taking a position to cover the hallway while his partners advanced. They moved to the immediate right. "Room to the right. Bathroom over here," an officer called out, kicking open doors and checking the small, enclosed spaces where a person could hide. "All right, clear right now," came the confirmation. The bathroom was empty. They pushed deeper into the house. "Milwaukee Police, we know you are in here. Announce yourself," the shout was repeated, a constant reminder that they were not there to sneak around, but to take control. One officer moved toward the back of the layout. "Does it come through to the kitchen?" "No," he observed, realizing the floor plan was more segmented than he anticipated. He adjusted his path. "I'll clear this. Hold on," he signaled to his team. The house seemed to sprawl in different directions, creating a tactical nightmare of blind spots and corners. "Least a whole bunch of other rooms," an officer muttered, noting the complexity of the search. As they swept through the living areas, the coordination became critical to their own safety. In the tight confines of the hallway and connecting rooms, the risk of crossfire was real. One officer found himself approaching a doorway from one side while his partner approached from another. "Police! Milwaukee Police! We know you're in here," the chant continued. "I'm on the other side of you," an officer warned his partner, ensuring they knew each other's positions relative to the walls. "You're on the other side of that door?" the partner asked, verifying the location. "Yeah, all right. I'm coming back out," the officer replied, de-escalating the potential for a friendly fire incident. He realized that if they both breached the same room from opposite ends without coordination, the situation could turn tragic instantly. "I just didn't want to get shot by you guys," he admitted, the tension of the search manifesting in a moment of dark, practical humor. They regrouped in the central area of the ground floor. They had checked the bathroom, they had checked the kitchen, they had cleared the bedrooms on the main level. Every room was empty. The furniture stood still. The air was stale. There was no sign of Angela Lane, and no sign of a struggle in the main living quarters. "Original clear," an officer stated, confirming that the initial sweep of the primary floor was complete. The house was secure, but the objective had not been met. Ellis had said she was in the house, but the house appeared vacant. The officers stood in the silence of the cleared floor, the adrenaline slowly ebbing into a cold realization. The main floor was just the surface. The horrifying secret Ellis had spoken of was not in the living room or the kitchen. "Milwaukee Police, we know you're in here." They called out one last time to the empty air. The only place left to look was down. The search was far from over. It was simply moving to a different level. The officers turned their attention to the door they had bypassed in their initial sweep, the door that led to the darkness below. The ground floor had offered them nothing but silence, but the basement was waiting. The ground floor was clear. The silence of the living room and the kitchen offered no answers, only a deepening sense of unease. The officers regrouped near the center of the house, their breath steady but their senses heightened. They had swept through the bedrooms and the hallways, finding nothing but the stillness of a home that had been abruptly abandoned. Yet, the confession hanging over them like a dark cloud remained unresolved. Ellis had been specific. He had not said she was in the bedroom. He had not said she was in the kitchen. He had said she was down below. The focus of the team shifted to the single door they had yet to open. It stood innocuous and shut, likely leading to the lower level of the duplex. If Ellis was telling the truth, the accident, the panic, and the final tragic act of concealment had all culminated in the darkness behind that wood panel. The lead officer approached the door, his weapon held in a low, ready position. He reached out and turned the handle. Unlike the exterior locks that had fought them so stubbornly, this door yielded easily. It swung open, revealing a set of wooden stairs disappearing into a profound, heavy darkness. The air that drifted up from the basement was cooler, carrying the stale, distinct scent of a space that had been closed off from the world. "Milwaukee Police, we know you're in here. Announce yourself," the officer shouted down into the abyss. His voice echoed against the concrete walls below, bouncing back without a reply. The lack of response was expected, but protocol demanded they give every opportunity for a peaceful surrender, just in case someone, anyone, was still down there alive. The team began their descent. They moved slowly, testing each step, their boots heavy on the wooden treads. The beams of their flashlights cut through the gloom, slicing across the shadows that danced in the corners. The basement was a labyrinth of storage and utility, a place usually reserved for the forgotten things of a household. Now, it was the focal point of a homicide investigation. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the layout opened up. The officers fanned out, their lights sweeping left and right, checking behind the furnace, the laundry machines, and the stacks of boxes. The tension was palpable. They were looking for a person, but they were prepared to find a tragedy. "Room to the right," one officer whispered, guiding his partner's attention to a partitioned area of the basement. They moved toward the designated space, their lights converging. The beam of the lead officer's flashlight swept across the concrete floor and up toward a utility sink. The light caught something that did not belong amidst the clutter of a basement. It was a shape, still and silent. The officer stopped. The frantic energy of the breach and the search evaporated in a single heartbeat, replaced by a cold, professional somberness. There was no need to shout for surrender anymore. There was no need to check for a pulse. The scene before them confirmed everything Ellis had said in the brightly lit station miles away. "Oh, yep," the officer said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "There is a dead body down here." The confirmation rippled through the team. The anticipation of the unknown was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a crime scene. The officer let out a sharp exhalation, a mix of frustration and sorrow. "God," he muttered, the weight of the discovery settling on him. "We are going to need more squads." He keyed his radio, his tone shifting from tactical to administrative. "Squad 7286, he called out to the dispatcher, identifying his unit. "Yeah, we are going to need more squads here." The dispatcher acknowledged, likely sensing the change in the officer's demeanor. "There is a confirmed fatality in the basement," the officer reported, indicating that the victim was beyond medical help. "Looks P&B pretty good," he added, confirming the finality of the situation. "Can you get us a couple more squads and a boss back there?" he requested, knowing that the arrival of a supervisor was now mandatory. The other officers stood guard, ensuring the scene remained untouched. They did not move the victim. They did not disturb the surroundings. They simply stood witness to the end of Angela Lane's life. One officer directed his flashlight beam away, trying to preserve the dignity of the scene while still illuminating the area for safety. "You know the injury?" "What is the injury?" another officer asked quietly, needing to confirm the cause of death for the initial report. The lead officer hesitated, stepping closer without touching anything. "Hold on. Stand by," he said, adjusting his angle. "You want to bring your light over here?" he asked his partner. The two beams crossed, illuminating the tragic truth. "Looks like a fatal wound," the officer confirmed. "Yeah, but I just don't want to. We are not going to move the body." He observed the area around the victim, noting the evidence that corroborated the violence Ellis had described. Visible signs of trauma, he noted for the record. "So you to that?" the partner asked, seeking confirmation of the sighting. "Yes, affirmative," the lead officer replied. The search was over. The house on Roosevelt Drive had yielded its secret. The officers stood in the cool, damp air of the basement, surrounded by the silence of the dead. Above them, the city continued its evening routine, unaware that the missing piece of a 2-day-old puzzle had finally been found. The realization of the senselessness of it all hung heavy in the air. "Crazy," one officer whispered into the dark. It was indeed crazy. A life ended, a body hidden, and a man sitting in a police station claiming it was all a mistake. But in the cold light of the basement, there was no mistake. There was only the stark, undeniable evidence of a life taken too soon. The descent was complete. The investigation had officially begun. The beam of the flashlight cut through the heavy, stagnant air of the basement, a sharp blade of white light slicing into the darkness. The officers moved with calculated slowness, their boots making no sound on the concrete floor. The silence down here was different from the silence upstairs. It was denser, colder, and carried the weight of something that had been hidden away from the world. The lead officer swept his light across the room, illuminating the mundane clutter of a household storage, boxes stacked in corners, old furniture draped in shadows, and the mechanical hum of the furnace. It was a space designed for utility, for the things people did not want to look at every day. But as the beam moved toward the far wall, it caught something that did not belong. "Room to the right," one officer murmured, his voice barely rising above a whisper. The team shifted their formation, their lights converging on a specific area near the utility sink. The plastic tub stood in the corner, a fixture common in laundry rooms, usually reserved for soaking clothes or washing hands. But tonight, it held the tragic center of the investigation. The lead officer stopped abruptly. The air left his lungs in a sharp, quiet exhale. The frantic energy of the breach, the adrenaline of kicking down the door and clearing the rooms, evaporated instantly, replaced by a heavy, professional sorrow. There was no need to shout commands anymore. There was no need to check for a pulse. The figure before them was motionless, frozen in a terrible tableau that confirmed every word Ellis had spoken in the safety of the police station. "Oh." "Yep," the officer said, the realization settling in. "There is a dead body down here. God damn it." The curse was not one of anger, but of resignation. It was the sound of a hope being extinguished, the faint hope that perhaps Ellis was lying, or that perhaps the accident was not fatal. But the scene offered no such mercy. The woman was positioned over the sink, her body slumped forward in a way that defied the natural posture of life. "We are going to need more squads," the lead officer said, his hand reaching for his radio, his eyes unable to look away from the victim. He keyed the microphone, his voice shifting into the flat, detached tone required for official transmission. "Squad 7286, he called out to the dispatcher. "Yeah, we are going to need more squads here. There is going to be a confirmed P&B female in the basement." The code P&B, pulseless and breathless, was the final administrative stamp on Angela Lane's life. It signaled to the responding units that this was no longer a rescue mission. It was a death investigation. "Looks P&B pretty good," the officer added, a grim confirmation that the state of the victim left no room for doubt or medical intervention. The other officers stood their ground, forming a perimeter around the immediate area to ensure nothing was disturbed. They were trained to see terrible things, but the domestic nature of this scene added a layer of tragedy that was hard to shake. The victim was not a soldier in a war zone or a criminal in the streets. She was a woman in her own home. "Can you get us a couple more squads and a boss back there?" the lead officer requested, knowing that the arrival of a supervisor and the homicide detectives was now mandatory. One of the officers stepped slightly closer, careful not to touch the floor where footprints might be preserved. He needed to assess the injury for the initial report, to understand the violence that had ended this silence. "You know the injury?" "What is the injury?" the officer asked his partner. The lead officer adjusted his stance, angling his light to illuminate the victim's head without disturbing her. "Hold on." "Stand by," he murmured. "You want to bring your light over here?" The two beams crossed, highlighting the devastation. "Looks like a GSW to the head," the officer concluded, using the shorthand for a gunshot wound. The injury was consistent with Ellis's confession of a close-range discharge. "Yeah, but I just don't want to. We are not going to move the body," the officer stated firmly, "but to be blood from the head region." "So you to that?" the partner asked, seeking a second confirmation. "Yes, affirmative," the lead officer replied. They stepped back, giving the victim space. In the harsh light of the flashlights, the tragedy of her final moments became clear. She was dressed in loungewear, comfortable clothes meant for a relaxing evening at home. It was a stark contrast to the cold, industrial setting of the basement. She had been safe in her sanctuary, and now she was part of a crime scene. Going to be black female, probably around 30 years old, the officer noted, cataloging the details for the log. Not conscious, not breathing, here for a couple days. The timeline Ellis had provided, 36 hours, seemed accurate. She had been down here alone, while the world outside continued to turn. The officers moved to clear the rest of the basement, checking behind the remaining obstacles to ensure the house was truly secure. But the energy was gone. The discovery had been made. "Crazy," one officer whispered into the shadows. It was the only word that fit. The senselessness of the act, the cold calculation of hiding her away, and the quiet confession that had led them here. It was all crazy. The officers stood vigil in the basement, waiting for the detectives to arrive, the silence of the house now heavier than ever, with the weight of the truth. The discovery in the basement had cast a long, cold shadow over the house on Roosevelt Drive. The officers, having confirmed the grim reality of Ellis's confession, now had to shift their focus from the dead to the living. The silence of the lower level was heavy with the weight of the tragedy. But as they moved back toward the staircase, a realization struck the team. This was not a single-family home standing in isolation. It was a duplex, a structure shared by divided lives. The architecture itself held a disturbing implication. While Angela Lane lay alone in the darkness below, life might have been continuing just a few feet above her. "Has anybody made contact with the upper?" the lead officer asked, his voice cutting through the thick atmosphere of the crime scene. "No, I've been down here just blocking all this off," his partner replied, remaining at his post to secure the basement. The priority shifted immediately. If there were people living on the second floor, their safety was paramount. The police needed to ensure that the violence had not bled upward, and they needed to determine if the occupants had heard the gunshot that ended Angela's life. The lead officer signaled for a welfare check on the upper unit. "Let's make contact with the upper. Make sure nobody's injured or anything up there," the officer commanded. They ascended the stairs, leaving the heavy air of the basement behind, and approached the separate entrance that led to the second-floor residence. The transition was jarring. Downstairs, time had stopped 2 days ago. Upstairs, the rhythm of daily existence likely continued, uninterrupted and unaware. The officer knocked firmly, announcing his presence not with the aggressive shout of a breach, but with the urgent inquiry of a welfare check. The door opened, revealing a tenant who looked out with confusion rather than fear. To this man, it was just a Thursday evening. He had likely seen the flashing lights outside and wondered what was happening, never imagining that the center of the storm was the floorboards beneath his feet. "You all right there?" the officer asked, scanning the tenant for any signs of distress or injury. "Have you heard any gunshots? You and your wife? You're both okay?" The questions must have seemed surreal to the tenant. Gunshots? Injuries? The neighborhood was quiet. The house was quiet. The tenant confirmed that they were fine, that the silence of their home had been absolute. "There's been a shooting," the officer informed him, shattering the illusion of safety. "And someone is in questions. You a front door okay? Use that." The officer gestured toward the main exit, establishing a safe route for the couple. He needed to keep them away from the lower level, away from the scene that was now being processed by the arriving investigators. "Use that if you got to get outside and ask me any questions or anything, okay?" the officer instructed, his tone firm but protective. Don't come down this. The instruction was clear. Do not look at what lies below. The tenant stood in the doorway, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. The police were not there for a noise complaint. They were there because the quiet man downstairs, the one who had walked into the station, had done something unthinkable. The tenant's mind raced to make a connection. He thought of the man who lived below, the figure who had been part of the periphery of their lives. I don't know if it's her baby daddy, a boyfriend. The tenant speculated, trying to put a face to the violence. Walked into our district and said that he, 2 days and a half ago, the officer explained, filling in the terrifying gap in the timeline. The revelation was horrifying. 1.5 days. For 36 hours, while the tenants upstairs ate their meals, slept in their beds, and went about their routine, a tragedy sat silently in the basement just beneath them. They had walked over the scene 100 times, separated only by wood and plaster, completely ignorant of the fact that their neighbor was gone. Oh well, why do people keep coming into districts like this? The officer mused to his colleague, a momentary lapse into the frustration of policing a city where violence often arrived with a quiet knock rather than a scream. The interaction with the upstairs tenants highlighted the terrifying isolation of the crime. Domestic violence is often described as occurring behind closed doors, but here it had occurred within a shared house, yet the wall of silence had been impenetrable. The gun had gone off, a life had ended, and the neighbors upstairs had heard nothing. You know, I want to make it easy on us. Make sure our numbers aren't. The officer trailed off, the bureaucracy of the job merging with the grim reality of the night. The tenants retreated into their home, but the sanctity of their space was gone. They were now witnesses to the aftermath, living in a crime scene. The officer turned back to the stairs, descending once more into the lower level. The presence of the living upstairs made the stillness of the dead downstairs feel even more profound. The house was a vessel of 2 distinct worlds, one of oblivious normalcy and one of hidden horror, separated by the thinnest of lines. The investigation would now have to navigate both. The interrogation room was a stark contrast to the chaotic silence of the basement on Roosevelt Drive. Here, under the hum of the ventilation system, Ellis sat across from the detectives, weaving a narrative that sought to bridge the gap between a loving relationship and a dead body. The police had confirmed the reality of his confession. Angela Lane was indeed deceased, hidden away in the dark. Now, the investigation pivoted to the most critical question: why? According to Ellis, the tragedy was not born of malice or rage, but of a playful moment that had spiraled terribly out of control. He leaned forward, his voice steady, as he recounted the events of that Tuesday morning. He described the atmosphere in the bedroom as light-hearted, a scene of domestic intimacy rather than conflict. They were horseplaying, he insisted, using a term that evoked images of childish wrestling or innocent teasing. In his version of the truth, there was no argument, no shouting match, and no history of immediate violence that precipitated the event. However, the details of this horseplay introduced a chilling element to the story. Ellis admitted that during their interaction, he had introduced a firearm into the dynamic. He described mishandling the weapon, a gesture he claimed was a joke. It was a terrifying game of pretend, played with a lethal weapon. He admitted that his finger was on the trigger, a violation of the most basic rule of gun safety. Yet he maintained that he had no intention of firing. The narrative then shifted the physical agency of the shooting onto the victim herself. Ellis told the investigators that Angela, perhaps annoyed by the gun in her face or playing along with the rough nature of their interaction, had jokingly directed profanities at him. Then, in a moment that would dictate the rest of their lives, she allegedly reached out and slapped the weapon. She slapped the gun, Ellis explained, suggesting that this defensive or dismissive motion caused his hand to jerk and the weapon to discharge. In his telling, the bullet that struck her was released not by his will, but by the kinetic energy of her own hand, striking the firearm. It was a defense that painted him as a passive observer to a mechanical failure, a man holding a gun who was surprised when it acted like a gun. The room fell silent as the detectives processed this account. The accident defense is a common refuge for those who stand over a body, but the physics of Ellis's story required a suspension of disbelief. A trigger requires pounds of pressure to pull, A slap usually knocks a hand away, not inward. Yet, Ellis held to this version of events. He described the immediate aftermath as a fog of panic, a state of shock where time distorted and rational thought evaporated. But the actions he took in the seconds and minutes following the discharge told a different story. One not of panic, but of pragmatic problem-solving. Ellis described how, panicked and unsure of what to do, he did not reach for a phone to call an ambulance. He did not scream for the neighbors. Instead, his first instinct was to manage the scene. He detailed how he moved Angela from the bedroom, where the shooting occurred, to a chair in the living room. This was a significant physical exertion, moving an unconscious or dying woman through the house. He then noticed the blood. The reality of her injury was making a mess of the home. This observation triggered his next decision, one that chilled the investigators to the bone. Realizing the blood loss was significant, Ellis decided to move her again. He carried her from the living room chair down the stairs into the basement. His description of what he did next was devoid of the chaotic franticness of a man trying to save a life. He told the police he placed her in a concealed area of the basement. He did not do this to wash her wounds or to administer aid. He did it, he explained, to contain the evidence. It was a decision based on cleanliness, on containment. He treated the catastrophic injury of his partner as a spill to be managed. This was the point where the narrative of the accident began to fracture under the weight of the evidence. A man in shock might freeze. A man in shock might run. But a man who moves a body twice and positions it over a sink to protect his flooring is operating with a terrifying level of rationality. The detectives listened, noting the disconnect between his words and his actions. He claimed he was devastated, that his life was over. Yet in the crucial moments when Angela Lane might have still had a chance, his focus had been entirely on the house. Ellis finished his account of the immediate aftermath. He described how, after positioning her in the basement, he returned upstairs to clean the blood that had been left behind. He used a cleaning solution, scrubbing away the evidence of the accident, while the victim lay alone in the dark below. The story of a tragic mistake was rapidly evolving into a story of a cold, calculated cover-up. The interrogation continued, but the image of the sink in the basement now loomed larger than the story of the slap in the bedroom. The narrative of a frantic accident, of a man paralyzed by sudden grief and shock, disintegrated completely when investigators looked at what happened after the silence fell over the house. Ellis had claimed panic, but his actions displayed a methodical, chilling composure. After moving Angela Lane to the basement and positioning her over the sink to control the flow of blood, Ellis did not rush upstairs to call for help. Instead, he went upstairs to clean. Using a cleaning solution he found within the home, Ellis began to clean the scene. He moved through the house, wiping away the physical traces of the tragedy, an act that required focus and time. He was not a man frantically trying to save a life. He was a man trying to save himself. The housekeeping took precedence over the humanity of the situation. Once the blood was cleaned, Ellis did not flee immediately. He returned to the basement, in a detail that speaks to a disturbing level of detachment. He sat in the dark, just feet away from the woman he had killed. He sat there for hours, smoking cigarettes, alone with his thoughts and the body. It was a macabre vigil, not for Angela, but for his own contemplation on what to do next. Eventually, Ellis decided it was time to leave. He took the gun, the .380 caliber weapon that had ended the dispute, and walked out of the house. He did not go to the police station then. He drove to a dollar store. There, amidst the mundane commerce of the city, he disposed of the weapon, casting it away in an attempt to sever the link between his hand and the crime. For the next day and a half, Ellis existed in a limbo of his own making. He contacted his sister, perhaps seeking counsel or perhaps just needing a ride, and it was she who eventually drove him to the police station. By the time he walked up to the desk officer, the accident had been scrubbed, the weapon had been ditched, and Angela Lane had been left alone in the cold for 36 hours. The detectives noted with grim significance that at no point during those long hours did he attempt life-saving measures, nor did he ever pick up the phone to call emergency medical services. While the investigation focused on the cold mechanics of Ellis's actions, A community outside was left to grapple with the void left by Angela Lane. She was only 29 years old, a young woman with decades of potential ahead of her. In the eyes of the law, she was a victim of first-degree intentional homicide. But to those who knew her, she was the vibrant center of a family. After the news broke and the police tape was finally removed from the duplex on Roosevelt Drive, family and friends gathered to hold a vigil. The grief was raw and palpable. They spoke of a woman who was defined by her generosity. One family member described her as always being the one who was caring and loving, the type of person who got something for anybody. She was a giver, a nurturer, whose life was extinguished in a moment of senseless violence. The tragedy was compounded by the isolation of her final moments. She didn't even have a life to live at 29 years old, a mourner lamented, highlighting the theft of her future. Another relative expressed the haunting pain of knowing how she died, saying, "What I know is my auntie died crying." The vigil served as a stark reminder that while Ellis sat in a cell worrying about his life being gone, the true loss belonged to Angela. She had called out for help in her own way. But as one family member stated, when she called out for help, nobody helped her. The community rallied around her memory, their candles flickering against the darkness that had consumed her home, vowing that her name would not be forgotten even as the legal system began its slow, grinding work. As the detectives dug deeper into the background of the couple, they sought to understand the dynamics that led to that Tuesday morning. Violence rarely happens in a vacuum. It is often the culmination of unseen tensions. In a retrospective search of the digital footprint left behind, investigators found social media posts made in the days and weeks prior to Angela's death. These posts served as a stark foreshadowing of the events that eventually became a reality, hinting at conflict and instability that had been brewing beneath the surface. Despite the violent end to their relationship, Ellis was a ghost in the criminal justice system of Wisconsin. He held no known criminal history in the state, a fact that perhaps allowed him to move through society without raising alarms until it was too late. This clean record is a terrifying commonality in domestic homicide cases. The perpetrator often appears normal to the outside world until the lethal outburst occurs. The death of Angela Lane was not an isolated incident, but part of a grim statistic. That year, she was one of 224 known persons to have been killed in Milwaukee, a number that represented the highest yearly homicide rate listed in the city's recent history. Her death underscored a pervasive epidemic of intimate partner violence. Statistically, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. Angela's story was a heartbreaking data point in a much larger crisis, a reminder that the most dangerous place for a woman is often her own home. The legal process moved with a deliberation that contrasted sharply with the sudden violence of the crime. Ellis was arrested and charged with 1 count of first-degree intentional murder, with a modifier for the use of a dangerous weapon. Despite his confession at the station, where he admitted to shooting her and hiding the body, Ellis entered a plea of not guilty. He held fast to his story of an accident, of horseplay gone wrong, forcing the state to prove his intent. His bond was initially set at a staggering amount, $1 million, reflecting the severity of the crime and the flight risk he posed. It was later officially set to $75,000, but Ellis would never post bail. He remained in custody, waiting as the seasons changed and the year turned. It was not until April of 2023, over a year after he had walked into the police station, that Ellis faced a jury. The prosecution laid out the facts: the use of the weapon, the failure to call 911, the moving of the body, the cleaning, and the disposal of the gun. These were not the actions of an innocent man caught in a tragedy. They were the actions of a man conscious of his guilt. The jury agreed. After weighing the evidence and the testimony, they found the 43-year-old Ellis guilty. The accident defense had failed. The truth of what happened in that basement was finally legally recognized as murder. The sentencing hearing was the final act of the legal drama. Ellis stood before the judge, no longer the man controlling the narrative in the interrogation room, but a convict facing the consequences of his actions. The judge, having reviewed the case and the pre-sentence reports, handed down a sentence designed to ensure Ellis would likely never walk free again. He was sentenced to 33 years in prison. In addition to the prison time, he was given 10 years of extended probation. The court granted him credit for the 385 days he had already spent in jail awaiting trial, but this was a small mercy in the face of the decades ahead. Crucially, the judge ordered Ellis ineligible for certain programs that could reduce his sentence. This meant he would have to serve the entirety of his time. The math was bleak. Ellis would not be released until April of 2055. By that time, he would be 75 years old. If he survived the prison term, he would then be on probation until he was 85 years old. Additionally, the court ordered restitution in the amount of almost $2,000 to one individual, along with roughly $800 in court fines and fees. The sentence was a holistic condemnation of his actions, stripping him of his freedom and his future, much like he had stripped Angela of hers. The case of the man who hid a horrifying secret in his basement had come to a close. The police tape was gone, the court documents were filed, and Ellis was transferred to the state prison system. Currently, his case is being processed by the Court of Appeals in an attempt to reverse the decision, but for now, the verdict stands. The outcome is a stark reminder that whether good or bad, everything we do in life has consequences. Ellis thought he could clean away the blood and hide the truth in the dark, but the truth has a way of surfacing. He traded a moment of violence for the rest of his natural life behind bars. For the family of Angela Lane, the sentence brings a measure of justice, but it cannot bring her back. The house on Roosevelt Drive remains, a silent witness to the tragedy, while the memory of the woman who lived there is carried forward by those who loved her. The story serves as a somber warning about the escalation of domestic conflict and the irreversible nature of violence. This case is a heavy one, and it reminds us that being in a relationship comes with its ups and downs, but it should never end in tragedy. I have seen my fair share of violence in intimate relationships over my career, and cases like this one always stay with you. It is important to remember the signs that something bad could happen: escalating jealousy, isolation from friends or family, or threats. If you see these signs, please take them seriously and get help. Thank you for joining me as we walk through this investigation. That is all I have for today, guys. Remember to be safe, and I'll see you on the next one.